Hey friends, Elizabeth here from Plant-Based Bride, back again with another video, and today I'm excited to share the creation of all of my reading journal spreads for March and April. This is also going to be my little wrap-up for all the books I read in March and April with sort of mini quick reviews for you. So this is a good overview whether you're just curious about the books I read or if you're more interested in my reading journal spreads, or maybe both. So hopefully you'll enjoy this one. This is the second time I'm doing these 2 months in one reading journal wrap-up style videos, and they definitely take quite a while to film and edit. So I apologize that this is a little late. It took me a couple more days to film than I expected, and then a couple more days to edit than I initially expected. I should also mention, if you're curious as to what goes into the prep work to set up my reading journal, how I find the images I use, how I size them and print them out, I recently made a video going through all of that in great detail using Canva, which you can use for free. So check out that video. I'll have it linked in the description box so you can go watch that if you want to see the prep work. So starting with the cover page for March, and I wanted this to be super moody. I had another cover page image in mind, but then when I went on Pinterest to find some more options just to have a gander, I came across this painting and it felt so perfect for March. It just had the most moody, atmospheric vibe to it. So I kind of changed the whole direction of this cover page, but I'm very happy with how it turned out. I'm also using my tea-stained paper as always. I'll link my tutorial in the description box if you want to make some tea-stained paper of your own. It is very easy. And some of my clear stamps and my washi tape. I'll try to link all the supplies I'm using in the description box as always, but if I miss something, please let me know in the comments and I can add it. Now that the cover page is finished, it's time to get started on my summary spread, my March Reads overview, and my March stats. So in March, I finished 6 books: Poverty by America, She is a Haunting, The Last Graduate, and The Golden Enclaves, which are book 2 and 3 of the Scholomance series, We, which was a reread, and Our Share of Night, which was our book club pick for March. You can join the PBB book club over on Patreon if you want. We read awesome books. The link is in the description box always. I definitely feel like March was a bit of a rebound month for me in my reading because I read so much in February, particularly to finish reading all the winners of the Goodreads Choice Awards for my Goodreads Choice Awards winners video. You can check that out if you missed it. Link will be in the description box. And Poverty by America was the last book for that video that I finished at the start of March. And then it's like I needed to take a short break, read at a slower pace, just kind of chill out a little bit. So I only read 5 other books in March, but I feel like I had a pretty good reading month, even though I only had 1 5-star read. 4 of the books I read were 4 stars, and my lowest rating of the month was 3 stars for We. But yeah, overall, it was a pretty good reading month, even though I read at a slower pace than usual, and it was kind of nice to take a little bit of a break. Moving on to my March stats, because I only read 6 books this month, I decided to steal a little bit of this left page for my stats. I feel like every year I add 1 or 2 new stats that I want to track, but the pages of my notebooks stay the same size, so I'm constantly struggling to fit them all on a single page. So when I can, I like to steal a little more room. As I've mentioned before, I like to track stats because I'm a nerd and I like charts and data. I find it fun and interesting, but I also feel like tracking my own stats really helps with keeping me more on track with my various goals, because sometimes during the month I'm just reading along, picking books willy-nilly and not necessarily really thinking about my various reading goals. But when I come to my reading journal and put together my stats, it becomes very clear to me when I'm falling behind on my various goals, like reading around the world and reading throughout history and reading more books with LGBTQIA plus representation and so on and so forth. So I find stats really useful for that reason, and also just cool and interesting. Like I mentioned, if you want to know how I make my stats, check out my Canva video. I break it down to very simple steps. So now that I have my overview spread done, it's time to start on my individual book entries. And as always, I like to start with a full page spread for our book club pick of the month. I just always end up with so much to say about our book club picks, no matter how I felt about them initially. So they always get a full page spread, and Our Share of Night definitely had a lot going on. So there was definitely more than enough to fill a full page spread. I also wanted to do 2 little half-page spreads for The Last Graduate and The Golden Enclaves. I feel like I had less to say about these, even though they were 4-star reads, possibly because they're continuations of a series, and they all were in a very similar vein. It is a YA series, so definitely didn't feel like I needed more than half a page to kind of get my thoughts down here. And as you can see, my process for setting up my book entry pages is to start by adding some creatively ripped and placed tea-stained paper, and then to add my borders for my book entries, and then I add my book covers and some art to represent the book. Again, check out my Canva video if you want to know how I find the art that I use and size it and all of that good stuff. But I also wanted to say that a couple people brought up in the comments of that video that I should really try to credit the artists, especially if I'm using fan art. And that is such a good point. It's something that has occurred to me before, and I just never remembered it at the right time to make sure that I wrote down the username of the artist or the artist's full name so that I could then put it in my reading journal. It just always escaped my brain at the times that it would need to be in my brain. But this time I remembered, and I feel like I'll be able to remember from now on. So thank you to the people who left those comments. You're totally right. I completely agree. And I was able to find the artists for not all of the art that I used in this setup, but a good percentage of it. So you'll see me adding handles for the artists or their full names if I know them, just somewhere near the art as I go through this setup. And then it's time to add some quotes. I love quotes. I love saving quotes from the books I read. I try to include them almost every single time, and I'll include more than one if I have the space. But I can't believe it never occurred to me until this setup that I should add some annotations to the quotes I put in my reading journal, because I'm always annotating quotes when I'm reading a book. You can check out my annotations video if you want to learn more about that, but I'm always highlighting, underlining, circling, adding emphasis in other ways as I'm reading. And for some reason, it never occurred to me that I could also add those little annotations and add emphasis that way in my reading journal until I was making these spreads. And as soon as it occurred to me, I couldn't believe I'd never done it before, and I wanted to go back to all my previous reading journals and annotate all the quotes. By the way, if you enjoyed my first annotations video and like listening to me talk about annotating in general, I have an exciting video coming up very soon where I'm going to be talking about annotating in ebooks when you're reading digitally, which is something I got a lot of questions about in the comments of my video about annotating. So I'm very excited to share that. So keep your eyes peeled. It's coming very soon. So let me talk a little bit about my thoughts on these books, give you little mini concise reviews. Our Share of Night was our book club pick, and this was not my first read by Mariana Enriquez. I read a short story collection. It was kind of all over the place for me. Some of the short stories I really loved, some of them I absolutely despised, and some of them I felt very meh about. So when my book club voted for this as their choice for our translated pick, I was a bit hesitant, not only because I wasn't sure if Mariana Enriquez was my kind of author or if I was the right kind of reader to appreciate her work, I suppose is the better way to put it, but also because this book is a monster. It is very, very long. So I was a bit reticent to get started, a bit nervous, but you know what? I was very, very pleasantly surprised. I will say off the bat, I'll include book cards for all the books I'm talking about in this video so that you can see any trigger or content warnings that I noticed while I'm reading, but definitely take a look at those if you're thinking about reading this book, especially if you are sensitive to mistreatment of children, because there is a lot of that. Some of it is very, very disturbing and upsetting. So I want people to be aware of that going into it because it was a lot to read. But that being said, this book was fascinating. The character development was really well done, very intricate and complex characters. All the characters were deeply flawed. Their relationships were very complicated and full of conflict. There was a lot of familial conflict and generational trauma. There's an occult element to this, a bit of a fantasy element to this, which I found interesting. I was really invested in the characters, especially Gaspar and Adela. Those two were just my favorite, and I felt very protective over them. I also loved that this book had so much LGBTQI plus rep. Almost all of the protagonists, with the exception I think of Gaspar, were queer in one way or another. There was a lot of bisexual rep. In particular, there was gay rep. There were relationships between men, relationships between women. There were different configurations of polyamorous and open relationships. And I appreciated that while many of the characters who were part of the LGBTQIA plus community in this book could be classified as villains or maybe not the best people ever, we also had one of the purest, most unambiguously good characters in the book, Pablo, as a gay boy and then gay man. It just felt very normalized in a way that I appreciated. The writing did occasionally feel a bit clunky to me, and I'm gonna chalk that up to the translation. The commentary on Argentinian history, especially the disappeared, wealth disparity, classism, the dehumanization of the poor, and the obsession the wealthy classes have with accumulating power and with immortality. There was just a lot here thematically that I found very intriguing. The characters were very interesting, and the plot and the mysteries and this occult sort of element were also very engaging. The book was just a little long. I don't think it had to be as long as it was. We did have a couple little side quests that I'm not sure had to happen, but overall, this was a very strong novel, very thought-provoking, and definitely was very worth the time it took me to read it anyway. I love how I said I was going to be brief and concise, and that was not brief or concise in the least. I'm going to try to be more brief and concise on the rest of my little reviews. Check out my Goodreads if you want my full reviews on all of these. They're all done. I was really good about it this month. I finished them all as I was making the video, so they all are already there for you to read. So moving on to The Last Graduate and The Golden Enclaves. Book 2 was a bit disappointing to me. Honestly, I still gave it 4 stars because I was still engaged and immersed. It was still exciting, and I had a good time. I listened to the audiobook very quickly and enjoyed the process, but I had a lot of issues with it. I continued to not like how Orion was handled. He just feels so blah to me. He has very little personality. That is explained a little bit in the 3rd book, but honestly not enough in my mind to make up for how little characterization he got. I also just felt like this book felt a little bit like a rehash of book 1, and it should have been an escalation. The stakes should have been so much higher. It should have been scarier and more intense. And it didn't feel like that. It felt like the first book was much more intense and the stakes were higher. Book 2 didn't quite capture me in the same way. Book 3 was definitely an improvement, although I will say that I did feel like something was lost in removing us from that closed room aspect of everything happening within the Scholomance. Entering into the wider world removed some of the magic for me in the series, but I really enjoyed the plot here. I really liked that the themes of privilege and classism and wealth disparity and nepotism really came to a head in book 3, and I really, really enjoyed that Novik got deeper into this. She got darker and more raw and blunt with it, and there were some really, truly disturbing, distressing elements to this 3rd book that really drove home those themes. The willingness of people in power to exploit and torture the poor or the less privileged for their own gain. This is also a heavy theme in Our Share of Night. Really, really poignant and visceral, and I really appreciated it. I'm glad that she went there. In finishing the series, like I said, Orion just felt like a missed opportunity. We learned more about why he is the way he is in book 3, and it was interesting, but so much more could have been done with his character, especially now knowing his backstory. I just wish we'd had so much more out of him, and I wish we got more of the Mals. But overall, I did enjoy this 3rd book. It might actually be my favorite of the series. I also really liked Liesel and Elle. I just loved that development, and honestly, I enjoyed them together far more than I enjoyed Elle and Orion together, so I'm just gonna keep shipping Liesel forever. So that's it for the first 3 books. Moving on to my next spread, and here I'm going to be creating spreads for We, Poverty by America, and She is a Haunting. I'm not going to talk about Poverty by America in this video because I'm already talking way too long about every book than I said I would, but also because I talked about it and gave a review in my Goodreads Choice Awards winners video, and I have my review on Goodreads. So check out one of those places to hear my thoughts. Just know I gave it 5 stars and I thought it was very good. We is a book that I read in the summertime, and I decided to reread it this year mostly because I listened to the audiobook on a road trip with my husband. We listened together. And something about being on a road trip, I feel like I was not listening as closely as I normally listen to audiobooks. And while it was a journey and it was interesting, I just don't feel like I was really reading it as closely as I typically like to. I don't feel like I got as much out of it as I would have if I'd even just listened to the audiobook at home. But I decided to reread it with my eyeballs using the physical book, and it definitely made it easier for me to really immerse myself and read it more closely. I still liked it a lot. It is sort of the precursor to some of the most famous dystopian novels in the Western world, like 1984 and Brave New World. This was written in the 1910s, 1920s, published in 1924, and was banned in the Soviet Union before it was even published. And there's a lot of Yevgeny Zamyatin picking up on the direction that society was going in the USSR, the way that the government was becoming more and more controlling of the populace, and that's really what We is exploring. It's also exploring the contrast between the collective and a society, us as a group or a community versus individuality. And this interplay is constantly coming up throughout the book as our protagonist is struggling with being an individual, but feeling compelled to strip himself of all individuality to be one with the collective, because that is the standard of the society he's a part of. It's really interesting. It's quite funny, but I do struggle with the representation of women and people of color in this book. Our protagonist has a Black best friend, and he is portrayed in a very racist manner, and there are also only 2 female characters with any real presence in the story, and they are both stereotypical caricatures of women. One is like the perfect, innocent damsel in distress who is soft and round and kind of silly and needy and is constantly being patronized and infantilized by everyone around her. And then we have this other female character who is the complete opposite. She's a femme fatale. She's harsh, she's sharp, she has this ability to tempt good men away from society with her evil feminine wiles. And, you know, again, this is a book that is 100 years old, so I try to read it with that in mind, but the misogyny and the racism were a lot. But yeah, it was a lot at times while reading this, so it's something to keep in mind. But if you are a fan of dystopian literature, if you really enjoy books like 1984 and Brave New World and other such classics of the genre, I think it's worth reading We. On to She is a Haunting. I picked this one up on a bit of a whim. I actually think a subscriber might have recommended this to me in the comments of a video, and I got it from my library, and I was really, really pleasantly surprised by this. This is a YA horror, and I kind of thought I was just going to listen to the audiobook as a quick little horror romp. It would not be too scary because it was YA, and it wouldn't be too hard to follow. It would just be an easy one. And honestly, in some ways, yes, that's true, but I was just really pleasantly surprised by this. The thematic content went a lot deeper than I expected. There is a lot of commentary on colonialism and colonization, really focusing on the French colonial period in Vietnam and the ways that Vietnamese people were mistreated in this time period, and then how that has been passed down as generational trauma. There were some really intense, grotesque, visceral metaphors for colonization, from the haunted house to the parasite element, both of which were elements of this metaphor of a colonized colonizing, invading force. I ended up being a lot more engaged, a lot more grossed out, a lot more freaked out, and a lot more thought-provoked than I expected to be going into this, and it was very, very good. I would highly recommend. This was very close to a 5-star read for me. Honestly, the loss of a star is mostly in the ending. I found it a bit rushed and confusing, to be honest, and there were a couple little details, especially in the historical element to do with, I don't want to give away spoilers, there are some flashbacks to the French colonial period, and what happened back then was quite confusing for me. I'm still not 100% sure the order of events, and then the ending of the story itself went off the rails a little bit. It wasn't terrible. I've read far worse endings, but it was just a little bit too confusing for me personally. I also wanted to say that I did love that the main character is bisexual, and we see sort of her developing this attraction to this other teenage girl that she meets while in Vietnam, and we have their budding romance, and it's really sweet and felt very genuine, and there was a lot of vulnerability there, and I really enjoyed that little subplot as well. So yeah, there's also some stuff there with parental abandonment and parentification and complex relationships with your family that were kind of just an added bonus, but were also very interesting to read about. So yeah, I was really impressed by this, and I would love to read more books by the author. So that brings us to the end of all my March spreads. So it's time to get into April, starting again with an April cover page. I made this cover page on live stream with my patrons, which was really fun to just hang out, catch up on life, as we like to do. And I still went with a moody vibe for April, but I tried to lighten it up a little bit. We're starting to get into springtime here. Then it was time to move on to my summary page. And in April, I read 10 books, 4 of which I talked about at length in my reading sequels to books I loved video, so go check out that reading vlog if you missed it and you want extensive spoiler and spoiler-free reviews for these 4 books. I'll link it down below. I also read a full sci-fi trilogy, the Silo series, because I had book 2 and 3 as ALCs from NetGalley. I don't know if the audiobooks were only just recently narrated or if these were new versions that came out. I'm not 100% sure because these books are not super recent, but I had book 2 and 3 as audiobooks from NetGalley, and I'd been meaning to get to them, but I had to read book 1 first, and I finally bit the bullet and borrowed Wool from my library and ended up enjoying it enough that I just listened to the whole trilogy in 1 month and also started the Apple TV show with my husband, and we finished the whole first season. So there's that. I also read 2 bonus horror novels in April, Unbury Carol and Little Eve, and read our book club pick for the month, which was historical fiction, and that was Let Us Descend. This was a fantastic reading month for me. My lowest rating, once again, was 3 stars. Both Shift and Dust got 3 stars from me. Unbury Carol was a 4-star read, and literally every other book I read this month was a 5-star read, which is a little wild. 70% of the books I read in April were 5-star reads. Just absolutely magical. I was having a fantastic reading month. I'm also doing my stats again, of course. I was still on a live stream with my patrons at this point, and Chewy heard me chatting with people and was not impressed that I was giving attention to anyone other than him, so he came for some snuggles, as he is wont to do. And at first it was really sweet, and he was just cuddling on my lap, which was nice as I chatted with my patrons. And then he decided that he would really prefer to be on top of my reading journal, which I know all of you with cats know exactly what this is like. It's like they have intrusive thoughts about lying down on top of whatever we're focused on. And I had just laid out all of my stats the way I wanted to put them down, and he decided to just mix them up, add some spice to my life. So enjoy the bonus Chewy content. He is such a floof, but I love him. I finished up all the stats and moved on to the book entries. Because I had so many 5-star reads this month, I have a lot of full page spreads here, starting with Let Us Descend, our book club pick, and Angel's Game, which was the first book I read for my reading sequels video. Like I said, I'm not going to rehash my reviews for the books I read in that reading vlog because I go into so much detail in that video, and my Goodreads reviews are up, so all that will be linked down below. But I do want to talk about Let Us Descend because I am not the biggest historical fiction reader. It's not that I never read historical fiction, because I certainly do, but it's never my first choice. But we, as a collective group in the book club, decided we wanted to read historical fiction in April, and this was the winner, and I was honestly blown away by this book. I thought it was so beautifully written, just gorgeous, gorgeous prose. The story itself was completely engaging and heartbreaking and devastating and absolutely beautiful. We have a young girl sort of on the cusp of womanhood, Annis, who is going on this journey that is sort of modeled after the descent through the circles of hell in Dante's Inferno. And in this case, this is the descent through the circles of hell that is slavery in the South, in the US. And it truly is hell. And it gets worse and worse every time. You don't think it can get worse, it gets worse. It's very difficult to read. It is absolutely heartbreaking. But like I said, it has this beauty to it. The writing is gorgeous. Annis is such a complex, layered, nuanced, beautiful character. Her relationships are incredible. It feels like everyone she comes across, she develops this really deep relationship with, no matter what the nature of the relationship, whether it be mostly positive or very mixed or very negative. She just has these very vivid, lifelike relationships. Her relationship with her mother is a through line through the entire story, and grief is a huge theme here and constantly returned to. And I was reading this while dealing with my own grief. My uncle passed in April, so a couple of these books I read before my uncle passed away, and many of them I read after he passed. And so whether these books just happened to have more content about grief, or I was just picking up on it more easily because of what I've been going through in my own life, I couldn't tell you, but it does feel like so many of these books had a central theme of grief, and Let Us Descend probably had the most content focused on grief. It was the most prominent theme in this book as a whole. It was just a really beautiful, beautiful book that absolutely blew me away, and I would highly, highly recommend it, although I would say to look at trigger and content warnings because it is a tough read. The Angel's Game I absolutely loved. This is a prequel to The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafon, and like I said, I talk about it a lot in my reading sequels video, so go check that one out. But suffice to say, I was obsessed with it. I absolutely adored it. Moving on to my next two spreads, we have Ocean's Echo and A Day of Fallen Night. The next two books I read in my reading sequels video. Again, not going to get into it because I have a whole long video about these books, but Ocean's Echo I absolutely adored. I love Tennille and Surratt. They are so wholesome and sweet. I adore them. They have the best dynamic. And I loved this book, 5 stars. A Day of Fallen Night is another one that had a really prominent theme of grief throughout and was so beautifully written. I love Samantha Shannon's writing style. I love her intricate world building, and I loved these characters, especially Wolf and Tunava, and especially Tunava. She is the best. She's so badass. I'm obsessed with her as a character. I would read a whole book just about her going on adventures. This was fantastic. Getting into my next set of spreads, I have a full-page spread for Parable of the Talents, which was the last book I read for my sequels reading vlog. This book was devastating, heartbreaking, and honestly a masterpiece. I need to continue to read everything Octavia Butler ever wrote, and I am so heartbroken that she is no longer with us to continue to write incredible books, because she has a perspective and an insight and a wisdom that is so valuable. I really wish the people who really needed to hear the message of this book would read it, but I feel like the people who need to hear the message the most would not pick this book up in the first place, and if they did read it, they would somehow manage to misinterpret every single thing about it. Moving on to the 2 little bonus horror novels I read in April, Little Eve and Unbury Carol. Little Eve I read because I read another book by Catriona Ward in the past that I enjoyed, The Last House on Needless Street. This is another one that I would say definitely be aware of the trigger content warnings. Same thing with Parable of the Talents, which is a very difficult read. Little Eve has a lot of mistreatment of children once again, so it's just something to be aware of. But the writing was absolutely beautiful. It's incredibly atmospheric. It takes place on a little island off the coast of Scotland, and it has this misty, mysterious, eerie, autumnal, dreary kind of vibe to it that is just absolutely palpable. The characters are very vividly drawn and flawed and complex. Their relationships are really interesting, and I loved that the central villain, who is absolutely despicable and such a villainous human being and evil and terrible, still wasn't some sort of a caricature or a cartoonish villain. They felt very real. The book was gorgeous. I was immediately drawn into it, and it was like I was in a fever dream until I finished it. I didn't come up for air even once. So if you're a fan of really atmospheric, beautifully written horror, I would recommend this. Unbury Carol is horror, but in a completely different way. Honestly, so many people seem to hate this book, and I can understand why, because it is not at all what you might expect going into a horror novel. This is basically a Western. Reading this book felt like watching all the spaghetti Westerns I watched with my dad growing up. My dad was born in 1950, and he loved Westerns growing up. So I used to watch, some of his favorite TV shows and movies from his childhood with him when I was a child. And this book felt like those movies with a bit of a darker twist. It definitely has horror elements. There's body horror. There's quite a bit of murder and death. There's some pretty disturbing moments, but overall it has a much lighter, sort of tongue-in-cheek, silly, almost melodramatic tone to it. It is very much a Western. So it's not your typical horror, and I can understand why it wouldn't work for some people, but I found it delightfully campy and kind of ridiculous, and I had honestly a great time reading it. My main critique is that we didn't learn as much about Carol as I would have wanted to, and Carol's condition. She's supposed to be the central character, and her condition is what sets everything into motion, but she's underdeveloped compared to the other characters, and her condition is left very nebulous. But overall, this book was very entertaining. So I feel like I need to keep reading Malerman's work because he just seems to have a very interesting, unique perspective on horror, and I appreciate that. Okay, we have finally made it to the final spread of this video. I'm setting up a cute little 2-page spread for the Silo series. Wool gets a full page because I absolutely adored the first book in this series, and then Shift and Dust get half a page each because they were a little bit of a disappointment in comparison, unfortunately. There's a lot that I can't say about this series because a lot of details are spoilers, but I will just say this is a sci-fi dystopian series where people are living underground in a silo, and they don't know why they're there. They don't know who built the silo. They don't know what happened to the outside world, but it is unlivable, and it's a microcosm of society in this silo, and they have all of their own structures of government and policing and so on and so forth, and it's a really interesting concept. And this first book in particular has incredible character development, which is what really, really intrigued me from the start. The characters are amazing. Their relationships are so deep and well developed, and even characters who are barely on the page felt so real and so intricately and carefully developed. I just adored it, and some of my favorite characters in this book were barely in the book, but they left such a huge impression on me. There's also a lot of mysteries to be revealed, and I really loved how some of them were revealed. There's one scene in particular with Holston. I don't want to say too much, but that scene will be with me for a very long time. The pacing and the way that that scene developed and the way that it sort of led us in one direction only to flip the script. It was so impeccably done, and I honestly had to stop and sit back and just process for maybe 10 full minutes after that scene because I was so blown away. This whole book was incredible. If you like sci-fi, please read Wool. It is so worth the read. And then go watch the TV show because the TV show is amazing as well. Unfortunately, I can't say the same about Shift and Dust. They're interesting. They give us more information about the silo. They talk about the background of how it came to be and who built it and why and what happened to the world. And, we get more of those questions answered. But things just went really downhill in terms of the pacing and in the character development department, especially. From what I can tell, Hugh Howey worked on Wool for a very long time. It was a series of short stories that he wrote, and he spent a lot of time pouring himself into this passion project. And I think that's why the first book, in combining all of those short stories that he spent so long working on, really feels so rich and cared for and just beautifully put together. Book 2 and 3 felt like they were written very quickly, and as far as I can tell, they were both published in the same year, so maybe they were. They felt a little more slapped together, and the characters were definitely worse off for it, especially the female characters, which are very stereotypical, very much caricatures, cardboard cutouts of female characters, which really sucked because the female characters in Wool were so incredibly beautifully developed and complex and nuanced. The female characters in these books were either evil femme fatale temptress or damsel in distress or bitter, jealous wife. Sounds a lot like We, which is kind of sad because these books were written almost 100 years later. The male characters also weren't very well developed. We have a new protagonist introduced in Shift, and he is the blandest character of all time. Not even unlikable, but he is unlikable, but he's just so boring that I couldn't feel anything for him at all, which was too bad. And even characters who were really well developed in the first book that continued into the rest of the series felt like they lost some of that sparkle, which was unfortunate. Still interesting. I'm glad I read them. I enjoyed learning more about the world. Some of the ways that things developed and some of the answers we got felt a little absurd in a way that I'm not sure I was expecting and I'm not sure I love, but I'm glad I got those answers. I'm glad I listened to these audiobooks, and they were good. They were fine. They just were not nearly as incredible as book 1, and my expectations were very high upon finishing Wool, so just keep that in mind. And with that, I have finished all of my spreads for March and April, so I'm just going to go back to my yearly spreads and fill them out, add all these spreads to my index, and write in little page numbers so that I can find everything. Fill in my reading tracker, because now I've read 40 books of my goal of 125. I've also made some good progress on my reading goals. I've completed my goal of reading 6 books with disability, mental illness, or neurodiversity rep. I've made some good progress on reading Doorstoppers. Completed my goals of reading 6 books respectively with BIPOC and LGBTQI plus MCs, read a couple translated works. I'm definitely not doing great on my reading in French and reading non-Western classics goals, as you can see, and I haven't read many Canadian books so far this year, so I should probably work on that. I'm also not doing great on my book bingo. I mentioned when I set this up that I felt like a lot of these prompts were very hard and were going to be prompts that I would have to specifically seek out, and that is proving to be true, and I have not been thinking about it in picking my books, so as you can see, I am not making any progress. I also read a couple books from my 24 books in 2024 spread, which was fun. My last yearly spread is my Reading Around the World spread, but unfortunately, even though I read books from various parts of the world in these past 2 months, they were all from countries that I have already read books from in the past couple years, so I didn't get to fill in any new countries. And with that, we've come to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed hanging out with me while I set up my reading journal for March and April, and enjoyed hearing my definitely not very concise thoughts on the books I read in these 2 months. Don't forget to check out the other videos I mentioned, including my reading sequels reading vlog, my Goodreads Choice Awards video. Go add me as a friend on Goodreads if you want to be friends over there. You can see all my reviews and updates as they come through. And yeah, I feel like I've been talking for ages, so I'm gonna go. Thanks so much for hanging out with me. I appreciate you all so much. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and subscribe if you haven't already, because if you're still here, I feel like we should be friends. And with that, I'm gonna get going. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you really, really soon in my next one. Bye, friends.